Hello and welcome. I'm Carol Cram, host of the Art and Fiction podcast. This episode features Margaret Porter, author of 16 novels. 4 of her novels are listed on Art and Fiction, including her newest novel, A Change of Location, in the film category, The Myrtle Wand in the dance category, and The Limits of Limelight and Beautiful Invention, a novel of Hedy Lamarr, both listed in the film category on Art and Fiction at www.artandfiction.com. Margaret Porter is an award-winning best-selling author whose appreciation for history, cinema, and foreign travel inspires her fiction. A former stage actress, Margaret also worked professionally in film, television, and radio. She lives in New England with her husband and dog. Welcome to the Art and Fiction podcast, Margaret.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Carol.
I am in awe of how many novels you've written. Is it 16 at the moment? Mostly you've been known for historical fiction, but your latest novel, A Change of Location, is a new departure into contemporary fiction. So first off, why did you decide to switch to a new genre?
The decision was made many years ago. This manuscript was begun 20 years ago. I was in the process of reinvention, changing from writing more historical romance fiction into straight historical fiction. And I just needed a palate cleanser. And I had had some experiences that inspired me to write a contemporary book related to a film production. And in the process of writing it, I decided that I couldn't write 2 books at once. So I couldn't write historical biographical fiction and a contemporary novel at the same time. So the biographical novel won, and this manuscript sat for 10 years, halfway finished. And I wrote several books in a row, some biographical, historical fiction, and one that was a reimagining of the ballet Giselle, the Myrtle Wand. And these were all very high conflict, some tragedy, spoiler, some people die in them, and very heavy. I wanted another, it was time for another palate cleanser. I thought, well, gosh, I'd really like to write something light. I've always been tempted to write contemporary fiction. And the light went off. It's like, oh, I've got this manuscript sitting around. Maybe I should pick it up, dust it off, and see what happens. And that's what I did.
I love that story. It's actually very similar to my own, my 4th novel, which is a contemporary novel. That was actually my first novel. I wrote it 10 years ago. It wasn't the first published. Same thing. I kind of needed a palate cleanser right during the pandemic because I was deep into historical
Exactly.
fiction. Yeah, I was actually writing about the plague in the Middle Ages, right when the pandemic started. I thought, no, forget it.
Yeah,
So
that'll
I just
do it.
love
That's,
that you
yeah.
said palate cleanser because I totally know what you mean. So what was your inspiration for A Change in Location?
I lived in a town that was used as a film location. And I
Uh,
went to a college, like my heroine Hannah, that was used as a film location. And a friend of mine and classmate was hired for different projects as a location scout, both for feature films that were shooting in the area regionally or locally, and also for advertising shoots. And she eventually went out to California to do that in an even bigger way. But I was just so fascinated as working as an extra or in the theater department of the concept of locations and location
mhm.
scouting, and her experience was really interesting to me. I was a performance person at the time. That was before I'd started doing behind the scenes sorts of things, but that interest stayed with me a long time. And then when I went to graduate school, I worked on location as an extra on a television series. And every time I was in England, it seems like we would stumble on a location shoot in the countryside or at a country house or someplace. And so that was the original inspiration 20 years ago, that I just wanted to write about a location scout who was scouting for a period film set in England.
Yes, it's really a wonderful idea to base a romance around where she's scouting for this location. Actually, could you just summarize A Change of Location for us, for those who haven't read it yet?
Hannah Ballard is half British and half American, but she grew up in Maine. So she's essentially a New Englander, although she has family contacts in Great Britain. And she has worked across the country in New England and elsewhere, and up in the Maritimes of Canada as a location scout for an independent film company, and she is promoted to location manager, which means she's not only in charge of choosing the locations, although she has to vet them, but it puts her in charge of sort of the whole location shoot. And so she is sent to London to meet with the people who are the location finders, which is what they call them in Britain, who are going to have chosen places for her to tour. And she wanders into a cheese shop because she's going to throw a little thank you party for these people who have helped her. And the gentleman in the cheese shop turns out to be not only an English nobleman, but also owns a great country house and is landlord of multiple villages in South Somerset. And he tells her that he has the perfect location for her film. And she's not quite convinced, but eventually she checks it out and it goes on from there.
So you obviously traveled a lot to England to research this. So why Somerset?
Well, Somerset, family and friend connections primarily, and just the familiarity of it and spending lots of time there. And as a location scout for my own novel, the area that I set it in is the area that I know best. There's a river, and there are villages around it. The architecture is lovely. There are lots of country houses around there, and so it just fit the story. And it's a chance to be there in this beloved place when I'm in the States writing books. And then when I go there, I can be there in the beloved place writing about it and fact checking and what's blooming now and what blooms then and which lane goes where and all that sort of thing.
It's such a beautiful part of the country. As we mentioned before we started, I lived in England for 4 years and I go back there every chance I get. I just love
Likewise.
it, especially all those lovely little villages in Somerset and Devon and all those places. Yeah, it's never gets old. It's
No,
beautiful.
never.
You've actually inspired me. I'm thinking I want to set something in that part of England now.
You should, you must.
Yeah, I
Yes,
might
yes.
well.
And
I'm
I'll
off
take
to
all the
Devon
credit.
soon.
Well, and I'm writing a follow-up book. It's not a direct sequel, but it's a follow-up book, and it's much more London-centric. But I couldn't resist returning to Stanwell House and the Milverville villages because there was a reason to do it. But I just wanted to go back and see those characters again.
I don't blame you. So, A Change of Location was described by one of your reviewers as a smart love story, which I really like that description. Why do you think that's true? Because I think it is true about this novel.
I take that as a compliment. I think that romance readers in general want a read that is, it may have some of the traditional tropes and it will have a happy ever after. But I
Mhm.
think they want to read that is engaging, but also it's not too fluffy, if that's the right
Yes.
word, so that the conflict is realistic. And even though it might be based on some misunderstandings or lack of information, that it's believable. I assume that's what was meant by that remark. But I like to think that any readers who like smart love stories, I read lots of contemporary romance and I've written historical romance and I still read historical romance, and every book I write, whether it's mainstream fiction or not, has some sort of love story at the core. So I think romance is a smart read, period.
It is, but I think the one of the reasons they might have said that is that it did feel formulaic. I
Hmm.
mean, I kind of was vaguely knew it was a romance in terms of genre, but it didn't really feel like that. It just felt like a really good novel about this woman and her challenges, doing a very interesting job. And yes, there is a romance in there, but as I said, it didn't feel formulaic, which I think is a great tribute to your writing.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think it can be a fine line sometimes in writing romance for today's market between
Hmm.
contemporary romance or rom-com and then what might be considered women's fiction, which might deal with more family issues or family conflicts or women's specific women and work and their work style and work life and the conflict with that, and maybe a love life or a home life or a family life or whatever, domestic life, whatever that could be, and trying to rise in a profession versus all the other demands upon them. So I
Yeah.
think maybe this book a little bit straddles the rom-com and women's fiction a little bit, but for marketing purposes, very clearly it's going to be marketed as a contemporary romance.
Yes, actually, Love 'Em on the Recipes is like that too. It kind of straddles the two because there is
Mhm.
romance in it. But like you say, it's about a woman coming to terms with her professional life and her personal life. So, what are some of the challenges of writing contemporary fiction that are different from writing historical fiction?
For this book specifically, I had to move forward 20 years in terms of technology. Filmmaking technology has changed massively. Equipment is lighter, microphones are better, location shoots, lighting equipment. You have many more choices, and that's why so many more films now are being like Bridgerton and lots of other things, Poldark and fill in the blank, can be
Mhm.
shot in these country homes much more easily and less frequently in a studio where a studio set is built. So there was that aspect of it. Also, personal communication has changed as well. In an original version of this book, people were picking up a landline telephone to contact each other. There was not the instant kind of communication that we have with texting and messaging, and you can be on one side of the Atlantic Ocean and someone else on the other, and you can still maintain your contact. And so that was definitely a challenge. Picking up something that had sat for 20 years, I was concerned that I would pick it up, read it, and go, "Oh my gosh, what was I thinking?" But the characters had never left me. They had lived inside my head all these years. I think the book is far better, much deeper, more even maybe more resonant with my own experiences. I was more familiar with the locations themselves. So those challenges were I was able to meet those without much difficulty. But I think that in general, the switch between historical fiction to contemporary fiction is more, it's a mindset, how people talk to one another and the language that they use. And you don't want to make something too contemporary, too slangy, because then its shelf life will be very short. So trying to manage that and keep it sort of in this middle of being contemporary, but not overly contemporary with use of language or anything, so that it can live on beyond the year 2024.
Yeah, the technology is a huge challenge I find with writing contemporary. I actually cheated and set mine in the 90s, so I didn't have to deal with
Oh,
smartphones.
brilliant.
But but I sort of feel, oh, that was cheating, and maybe I should try again with the contemporary technology. But yeah, it is very, very challenging. It's
Well, I tried to be really careful. I didn't specifically mention FaceTiming or
yeah,
Googling. I would say internet search, or, try to maintain in the terms that I think will live on. Whoever, never mind who's, whether there's a Facebook in 10 years or something like that. And so that was a fun challenge to sort of massage the lingo and not go what, some contemporary books will talk about, on their Apple Watch, or they're
yeah.
FaceTiming a friend or something like that. That's really very particular to the here and now, which might change. And that was kind of a little game I played with myself to try to avoid that.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's good advice too, to try and be a little bit more generic. Yeah. Would you like to do a reading from A Change of Location?
Certainly. This kind of ties into the setup I gave. Hannah has been lured down to Somerset, having already visited other locations. After a surprisingly sunny, trouble-free tour of the hamlets and houses, the weather and Hannah's outlook abruptly changed, not only because of gray skies and intermittent rainfall. This was the 10th anniversary of Chase's sentencing. Today, her mind frequently darted back in time to that chilly April afternoon when she'd helped her grandfather stack his lobster traps. Without her uncle's stream of jokes, the job had taken longer than usual. She remembered how the breeze rippled the water beyond the dock and the shimmer of sunshine on the surface. The screeching gulls drowned the droning voice coming from the portable radio until Grandpa turned up the volume. A decade on, she could still hear the words with perfect, piercing clarity. Chase Ballard, convicted of manslaughter, a 10-year sentence, transferred from Cumberland County Jail in Portland to the Maine State Prison in Warren. He'd taken her fishing in his motorboat and helped her haul in her catch, shown her the best places on the river to spot eagles and ospreys and herons, supervised her 4-H projects when her parents didn't have time. An only child, she felt so lucky to have a big brother and uncle rolled into one. Someone to have fun with, whose shoulder she could cry on, not that she often did. She twisted her car's radio volume button. As the final notes of an upbeat song faded, a pair of presenters began rehashing the latest development in the widely publicized Sterling scandal. Several days ago, darting into a bookshop in the Reading railway station, she'd noticed large boldface headlines on the tabloid newspapers and garish color photos of a member of parliament and his glamorous lover, whose connection to an infamous crime family had recently been uncovered. Hannah hadn't imagined that her opinion of the British press and its characteristic obsession with the private lives of public figures could sink any lower. Current events proved otherwise. Her expectations for Stanwell House weren't high, a judgment based on a few low-res images produced by her internet search, and doubts nagged her as she approached the final stop on her tour. Shooting interiors and exteriors in a private residence would be a hell of a lot trickier than at any of the sites recommended by the location agency.
Thanks very much. That's great. That gives a flavor of it and of Hannah, who is a great character. I really enjoyed Hannah.
Thank you.
She was, well, she was smart, but she had her problems as well. So, which of course is what makes a great character. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about your historical novels. But at the moment, three of your historical novels are included on Art and Fiction. Now, I actually read Beautiful Invention about actress and inventor Heddy Lamarr. So, why did you decide to write a novel based on Heddy Lamarr?
A combination of factors went into that. Primarily, I'm a cinema buff. I have a master's in radio, television, film. I studied film history extensively, and I love old movies. So when I was growing up, if my mother and my dad was in the military, and if we dressed up to go to a military ball or go to a party, or I was dressed up in a play or something, if we looked really, really nice, my dad would always say, "Oh, you look gorgeous. You look just like Heddy Lamarr." Well, my mother looked more like Heddy than I did because she has black hair. So I knew the name before I knew anything about Heddy Lamarr. And to me, I just thought, oh, this is just some black and white movie queen, my dad's movie crush. No big deal, but thanks for the compliment. And some years later, and I remember it like it was yesterday, I was sitting at our lake cottage and I had just watched a black and white movie on Turner Classic Films. And I think it was a Katharine Hepburn picture. And I decided I was going to do some Googling about Katharine Hepburn and the making of that film or something. And for some reason, I guess because it was MGM or I'm not sure, but Heddy Lamarr's name came up. And I thought, oh yeah, that's Dad's movie star crush. And I started following links about Heddy Lamarr and saw that she had invented technology during World War II and that she had been recognized and had received an award for this accomplishment, which did not go used because during World War II, before America got into World War II, she and her co-inventor had created this technology known as frequency hopping, which would have enabled torpedoes from the Allies to maneuver through the ocean without being detected by the U-boats and run by the Nazis. And I was just fascinated. I said, I have to write this. I mean, this is a story. And so I started seriously researching Heddy Lamarr, fortunately about, two main biographies of her life, plus a book about her invention, had relatively recently been published. And then I went down the wonderful rabbit hole of this was my first 20th century novel, having written about 17th century and 18th century and early 19th century. And I learned that, you have your newsreels, you have your newspaper articles, you have your movie fan magazines, the wealth of information was massive, not only for Hollywood press or the American press, but also because she was an actress and a notorious actress in Austria. So I had to read articles that in German, and it was a lot of research and then winnowing that down to what do I really need to tell this story about Heddy? Where do I start her story? Where do I finish her story? And that's how Beautiful Invention came to be. I wish my father had been alive to to have read it, but he knows, I guess.
Yes. Yes, I really could see how much research you must have done. It's a lot of fun to read about Hollywood in that period in late
Oh
30s,
yeah.
early 40s. She sure had an eventful life. Wasn't she
Well, she
married
did.
6 times? Yeah.
Yes, yes. And about challenges of writing books, she kind of created her own myths about
Yes.
herself, which before she started doing it, Hollywood was doing it for her. The press office at MGM was creating all this information about her and also trying to sort of clean up her act because she came over with quite a reputation. She was divorced from a man who had been in cahoots with the Nazis. And so she wrote an autobiography that was ghostwritten for her, and it was very inaccurate, very salacious. She sued the writers of it and said that it gave the wrong impression. But a lot of those myths that either she or Hollywood created have been perpetuated through the years, even up to and including in documentaries about her. And the challenge for me, for any book just about, is myth busting. I want to be able to present the factual truth that I find through my research. Sometimes it will confirm the general knowledge, and sometimes it will just completely counteract it. And that was sort of a directive for me for researching Hedy. How did her first marriage end? Why did it end? Did she really drug her maid dress up in a uniform, the maid's uniform, and leave her husband's house with only the clothes on her back and nothing else? That's completely not true. She and her husband were already practically in divorce proceedings. He was off on a hunting trip. She packed up all her clothes and her jewels and she went to Paris and lived high. Then she went to London. And so, but it made a good story. And that story has been perpetuated, and
Yes.
which is fine, but that's not really how it happened. So my book was an effort to set the record straight.
Yes. And how would you describe Hetty's character, like as a person? What do you think motivated her?
She was a problem solver. I mean, that's why
Interesting.
she saw German U-boats attacking with torpedoes transport ships from Britain, taking refugee children to Canada, where they could either live in Canada or come to the United States. And U-boats were sending out torpedoes and hitting those ships with loss of life in many instances. And it drove her crazy. And so she remembered, having been wife of a munitions manufacturer, some of the conversations and sorts of people she'd met and the technologies that the Germans and the Austrians in cahoots with them were trying to develop, and the notion of wireless guidance systems stuck with her. And so that's why she decided to create it. She saw a problem. Hitler was killing children in the seas of the North Atlantic, and she needed to stop it. And so she and her co-creator, Georgianne Tile, put their heads together, and they each had the right kind of knowledge and drive to make this happen. They handed it over to the Navy, and ended up on a shelf because at the time, and this was even before America had entered the war, but you could tell it was going to happen. They were so busy developing weapons and getting ready to use weapons they already had that they just didn't have what we would say the bandwidth, ironically, considering what Hedy's invention led to, but they didn't have the bandwidth to create these new weapons. So her invention sat on the shelf until it was sort of rediscovered at a time when satellite communications first, and then later wireless technology, Bluetooth and all of that. She was the grandmother of some of these technologies that we rely on every minute of every day. So she was inventing other things. She wanted to invent a new kind of Kleenex dispenser. And she thought that stoplights should be more sideways instead of up and down. Now we actually have some that are sideways. She developed automobile bodies. She worked with Howard Hughes, who was, as we know, was an inventor in trying to decide how the wings of certain planes should be shaped. They be more shaped like a bird or more like a fish or more, I mean, that was her nature. And she was also a painter, an artist. She was a very creative person. She did woodworking, she did painting, she liked to garden, she had her little homestead farm. And she was a busy person and a doer. And she, I think, acting for her ultimately sort of became a trap. Her beauty was very much a trap because that's all people wanted from her. And so she didn't always get the best roles at MGM. She had a huge comic flair. She was really, really good at comedy, but they kept putting her in these femme fatale movies that were not
Mm.
as well scripted. And she wanted to do more comedy. One of my favorite films of hers is Comrade X with Clark Gable. And it is just hilarious. She does physical comedy. It's just really funny. And you think, oh gosh, it's kind of a waste that she was the great beauty and not the more of a screwball type actress.
Well, it's wonderful that finally we are learning about how smart she was and all the things that she did
Indeed.
because, for many years she was, the most beautiful woman in the world.
Right.
But yeah, there was a lot more to her.
Oh yes. And she was always looking for the knight in shining armor, the right husband. Too many of them chose her as a trophy wife. The ones who didn't weren't worth having. And that was an unfortunate aspect, that she maybe didn't marry the one that she should have.
Yes. So you also wrote The Limits of Limelight, which we've
Yes.
listed in the film category on art and fiction. And tell us a little bit about that novel.
Well, that's the book that I discovered while I was researching the Hedy Lamarr book. For some
Hmm.
reason, I was trying to determine if Heddy and Ginger Rogers had been at an event, I think it was, or a premiere or something at the same time. And I wasn't really trying to get Ginger into the book because the book was already jam-packed with Hollywood celebrities of the 1930s. But I don't know. There was just some research question. I was looking up Ginger Rogers and I discovered that Ginger Rogers had a first cousin
Hmm.
who Ginger and her mother, Layla, had plucked out of Oklahoma City and taken to Hollywood to make a movie star, just as Ginger was becoming really popular in the films, just kind of at the start before she was performing with Fred Astaire as a dancer. And that I thought, oh my gosh, I had no idea that Ginger Rogers had a first cousin who was in the movies also. So off I went, did a little bit of basic research, and then I found out many more things about Phyllis Fraser, who was born Helen Brown. And she's the one who gave Ginger Rogers her nickname Ginger, because Ginger's first name is Virginia, and Helen, little baby Helen, couldn't pronounce it. So
Oh,
she called her Ginger. And they were quite close, these cousins. And then when Ginger and her mother took Helen out to Hollywood to try her luck in the films, Ginger gave her cousin a name, chose a screen name for her cousin, which was Phyllis Fraser. And as a former actress who became a writer, that was an aspect of Phyllis that really drew me in. How you go from performing, but you're a reader all the time. You like to write. So Phyllis got into writing for the fan magazine. She did some photography, and ultimately she ended up in New York. And on beyond the conclusion of my book, she worked at Random House Publishing with her husband Bennett Cerf, and she worked with Dr. Seuss and helped to invent the series of books that The Cat in the Hat and all of those early reader books that Dr. Seuss produced. She was an editor and ran that division. So and then she became a New York socialite and went on to have a whole other life. So she was just an amazing person that is not extremely well known. And
mhm.
unlike a Heddy Lamarr, who did have a high profile, Phyllis did not have such a high profile, but Ginger certainly did. And so that was an opportunity to, kind of write about Ginger Rogers without writing about Ginger Rogers as the main character, but to have her more in the periphery with this extraordinary cousin that she had, who struggled in Hollywood while her cousin Ginger was becoming the pinnacle of success in the films with Fred Astaire.
I love that both of those main characters, like in both novels, were constantly kind of reinventing themselves in a way. I mean, the idea that you start something and you stick with it for your whole life is not true. And I think
Mm.
we're kind of living proof of that. You had other careers, I've had other careers, now we're novelists. And so it's interesting to write about these women, from 50, 60, 80 years ago that did the same thing.
Yes, and the fact that their accomplishments at the time, they found the way to use, and this is true especially in historical fiction that's set farther back in time, as you know, that kind of soft power, being able
Yes.
to use their female special powers to create the kind of life that they want, not strictly on male terms or being defined by men. It was harder for Hetty than it was for Phyllis, because ultimately Phyllis went into publishing, which, as we know, women have been in publishing for a long, long time. But it's really interesting to write about and study about when doing research. These women in the past, of whatever generation of the past, who found a way to make their way. And sometimes they were satisfied with the choices they made and the fate that they ended up with, and sometimes they weren't. But that's where good stories come from.
No kidding. I mean, they refuse to be victims. I think we tend to have a bit of a black and white idea of the past. So, women were kept down. Well, no, women
Mhm.
did a lot.
Yes.
And they did reinvent themselves and they did have soft power. So I love that. Yeah, my books are kind of that theme as well.
Mhm.
Your most recent historical novel is The Myrtle Wand, which is a retelling of the classic ballet Giselle. So tell us why you chose this subject for a novel.
I'm just obsessed with ballet as a dancer, a performer, the whole world of ballet, the physicality of it, the beauty of it. And in fact, two of my next three novels have dancers in them. But I happened to attend a live broadcast of the Ballet Giselle directly from Moscow, from the Bolshoi Theater. That was not exactly a recreation, it was a restoration, I guess you would say, of the Ballet Giselle, which debuted in the 1840s, of the original story of Giselle, which is classically known as one of the great canons of the ballet world. But originally, the girl Giselle falls in love with the nobleman in disguise, doesn't realize he's engaged to somebody. She meets the fiance, and in the version of Giselle that you will normally see in ballet, the fiance is a complete and total bitch and hard-hearted and doesn't care about Giselle's tragic fate, and is mad and not very nice. Well, in the original version, the the fiance, Princess Bathilde, was just this lovely person. She was kind to Giselle. She gives her a necklace. She asks Giselle to dance for her. She is just completely warm and lovely. And then when Giselle finds out that the Duke is engaged to the princess is just mortified. She's sad. She grieves when Giselle, spoiler alert, dies and cries and is very sad. And then in the second half of the ballet, there's the sequence of where the ghostly women, the wheelies, come up from the graves and chase men who betrayed maidens and try to kill them. But at the very end of that original story, there is a reconciliation, and the princess returns, and Giselle tries to put her betrayer back with the woman he was supposed to. I mean, it was just beautiful bookend. And I thought, oh my gosh, I never knew this was originally the way it was supposed to be. What is the deal with Princess Bathilde? Who is this woman? Who is this woman? And so I decided to write her backstory and her forward story, and then weave in the characters, including the queen of the dead girls. And so I made Giselle and Mert and Princess Bathilde begin their friendship sort of in rural France, in an area that I know where family come from. And I set the whole thing in, instead of 19th century, whatever, or medieval times, which is quite frequently a setting. I wanted to write another 17th century novel. I wanted to write a novel set in France. And I decided that I would set it in the early reign of King Louis XIV, and before he created Versailles. When he was a young king, his mother was still the regent for most of the time. And so it's kind of a mashup of a lot of things, um, that fascinated me. The ballet, the original story, the area in Jusev that I know quite well, uh, Paris, and the castle and court life of the aristocracy and nobility of France, how they lived, grape growing, winemaking, Louis XIV, his love of dance and music and all of this. So that's how the Myrtle Wand came to be.
Isn't it wonderful that we get to be novelists and we get to explore all of our different interests like you did in that novel? It's
Absolutely.
great.
And people say, what do you do when you have writer's block? Or how do you deal with writer's block? And I think I if I have writer's block on a project, I've got them stacked up, because I've got all these things are so intriguing to me, and I want to create some kind of a novel from. So I have so many ideas and so many more books that I would like to write. I wish I were a faster writer, but the Myrtle Wand was the fastest book I wrote, and both it and The Limits of Limelight were kind of both written during the pandemic. And I know some writers had a little bit of difficulty focusing when
Yeah.
all of that was going on. And for me, I wasn't traveling as much. I wasn't traveling at all for a certain period of time. And I was able to live in other worlds as the world around us was coping with how do we live in this world when we have to be contained and live. Well, that's kind of a writer's dream, is to just shut out the rest of the world and to be able to produce and not do much else. So I had a very productive pandemic, and now I'm sort of back to my little bit slower writing style, I guess you would say.
Yes, well, like me, you like to travel a lot too, and I find that that does kind of interfere with my
Mm.
process. So, one of my goals with the Art and Fiction podcast is to inspire other authors. So, what's one thing you've learned from writing your novels, your many novels, that you didn't know before?
Well, if you can't tell from everything I've said so far, you have to write what you're truly, truly passionate about. And you have to write what you are truly, truly passionate about reading. That to me is just, it's kind of like the crucial advice to any writer, whether they're writing fiction, nonfiction, poetry, doesn't matter. The the market, the fiction market, the writing, the book market, the publishing world has just always been a little weird. And there are trends that come and go. And, when I first started writing A Change of Location, rom-com and chick lit were hot, hot, hot. And then they weren't hot, hot, hot anymore. And that's not why I stopped writing it. But when I picked it back up again, I realized not this wasn't a choice I made because of it, but that the market for rom-coms and chick lit was hot, hot, hot again. The timing worked in my favor, but it was purely coincidental. I wasn't chasing a trend. I wasn't writing to the market. I was telling a story that I loved and wanted to complete. I think that's really important, because I think the excitement, the enthusiasm, and the passion for whether it's a historical character, a historical period, a contemporary setting, or type of person or profession, any of those things, I think it carries through in the fiction. It certainly pulls you through on the harder writing days when you have to remind yourself, why am I writing this book? But I think for aspiring writers, if they're not sure what they want to write, they should ask themselves, what do I most like to read? What are the books on my TBR? And where's my what do I check out of the library? Or what shelf in the bookstore do I go to most often? So it's kind of, I mean, I don't know if it's cliche or trite advice, but for me, that's where it began. What's where it begins, with any project.
I
And I
think
think,
it's great advice, and I think it's very, very true. We do have to write what we like to read. Thank you so much, Margaret, for chatting with me. It's just been great.
Carol, this has been an enormous pleasure. I know we have so much in common in terms of the types of books we write and the travels to England. And I'm a fan of your podcast and still working my way through a lot of the episodes because of the types of writers you have on and the whole concept of art and fiction. There's so many arts and so many ways to portray it in fiction through so many different types of characters. And it's so well reflected on the podcast.
Thank you. Yes, well, because my novels are inspired by the arts, I've thought Gee, I wonder if other people have written novels inspired by the arts. Well, apparently they have.
Oh,
We have well
yes,
over 2,000 books now on the website.
it's wonderful. Thank you so much for your support of that too.
I've been speaking with Margaret Porter, author of 4 novels listed on Art and Fiction, including A Change of Location, The Limits of Limelight, and Beautiful Invention, a novel of Hedy Lamarr, all listed in the film category, and The Myrtle Wand listed in the dance category on Art and Fiction, www.artandfiction.com. Be sure to check the show notes for a link to Margaret's website at www.margaretporter.com. You'll also find a link to a 20% discount on a subscription to Pro Writing Aid, a fantastic editing tool for writers. If you are enjoying the Art and Fiction podcast, please help us keep the lights on by making a small donation on the Ko-fi website. The link is in the show notes. And please follow Art and Fiction on Twitter and Facebook. And don't forget to give the Art and Fiction podcast a positive review or rating wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.